Question 1. Quality control measures reveal that a draft medical education slide deck intended for an upcoming scientific congress, focusing on a novel mechanism of action for a therapeutic area, contains detailed efficacy data, but only briefly mentions potential adverse events. The material was developed by the medical affairs team with input from key opinion leaders, CAL, and is intended to educate HCPs on the latest scientific advancements. What is the most appropriate next step for the medical affairs team to ensure compliance and responsible dissemination of information? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the slide deck with the regulatory affairs and legal departments to ensure fair balance, accurate representation of all available data, including risks, and adherence to all applicable promotional and educational guidelines before dissemination. Option B. Proceed with the slide deck as drafted, assuming that the scientific congress setting inherently implies a focus on efficacy, and that KOL input signifies adequate scientific rigor. Option C. Distribute the slide deck to a select group of internal medical science liaisons for their feedback on scientific accuracy before presenting it to the broader healthcare professional audience. Option D. Immediately revise the slide deck to remove all efficacy data to avoid any perception of promotion, focusing solely on the mechanism of action in a highly theoretical manner. Correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the slide deck with the regulatory affairs and legal departments to ensure fair balance, accurate representation of all available data, including risks, and adherence to all applicable promotional and educational guidelines before dissemination. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical affairs, ensuring that educational materials provided to healthcare professionals, HCP, are balanced, accurate, and compliant with regulatory expectations. The core tension lies between the desire to disseminate valuable scientific information and the imperative to avoid misleading or promotional content. The professional challenge stems from the subtle line between education and promotion, and the potential for even well-intentioned materials to inadvertently cross this boundary, leading to regulatory scrutiny and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to assess the intent, content, and context of the communication. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, multifaceted review process that explicitly considers regulatory compliance and scientific accuracy. This involves engaging cross-functional teams, including regulatory affairs and legal, to scrutinize the material against relevant guidelines. The focus on objective scientific data, balanced presentation of benefits and risks, and clear disclosure of any potential conflicts of interest aligns with the principles of responsible medical communication and the ethical obligations of medical affairs professionals. This proactive approach mitigates risk by ensuring that educational initiatives are grounded in evidence and conducted with transparency, thereby upholding the integrity of scientific exchange and protecting patient welfare. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the scientific merit, without adequate regulatory review, fails to acknowledge the legal and ethical framework governing pharmaceutical promotion and medical education. This oversight can lead to materials that, while scientifically sound, may be perceived as promotional or may not adequately disclose risks, violating regulations such as those pertaining to fair balance and off-label promotion. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed to market over comprehensive review risks disseminating information that has not been adequately vetted for accuracy, balance, or compliance. This can result in the unintentional spread of misinformation or biased data, which is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. A third incorrect approach that relies solely on the opinion of the medical science liaison, MSL, without independent verification or cross-functional input, while potentially leveraging their expertise, bypasses essential checks and balances. This can lead to subjective interpretations or an incomplete understanding of the regulatory landscape, increasing the risk of non-compliance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic risk assessment. This begins with clearly defining the purpose and audience of the communication. Next, all relevant internal policies and external regulations must be identified and applied. A robust review process involving appropriate stakeholders, e.g., regulatory, legal, medical, is crucial. Documentation of the review process and decisions made is essential for accountability and future reference. Finally, A commitment to continuous improvement and staying abreast of evolving regulatory guidance is paramount. Question 2. Upon reviewing the monitoring visit report for a Phase III clinical trial, a medical affairs specialist notices a discrepancy in the source documents compared to the case report form, CRF entries, for a significant number of patients at a particular site. Specifically, the CRF entries appear to omit certain adverse events that were documented in the patient's medical records. The trial is nearing its data lock deadline. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the medical affairs specialist? Option A. Immediately escalate the observed discrepancy to the clinical operations team and the data monitoring committee, providing all relevant documentation, to initiate a formal investigation into potential GCP noncompliance. Option B. Discuss the observation informally with the site monitor to gauge their opinion on the severity before taking any formal action. Option C. Advise the principal investigator at the site to correct the CRF entries to align with the source documents, emphasizing the urgency due to the upcoming data lock. Option D. Document the observation internally but wait for the next scheduled review cycle to address the discrepancy, as the data lock deadline is imminent. The correct answer is A. Immediately escalate the observed discrepancy to the clinical operations team and the data monitoring committee, providing all relevant documentation, to initiate a formal investigation into potential GCP noncompliance. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical affairs, ensuring adherence to good clinical practice, GCP, principles when faced with potential deviations that could compromise data integrity and patient safety. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need for timely data collection with the absolute requirement for ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. Medical affairs professionals must exercise sound judgment to identify, assess, and address potential GCP violations proactively. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the integrity of the clinical trial and the safety of participants, which are foundational tenets of GCP. By immediately escalating the observed issue to the appropriate internal stakeholders, clinical operations, and the data monitoring committee, the medical affairs specialist ensures that a formal investigation can be initiated. This aligns with ICH GCP E6 R2 Section 4.1.1, which states that the sponsor is responsible for implementing and maintaining quality management systems and quality control procedures to ensure and control the quality of all aspects of the trial. Prompt reporting is crucial for the sponsor to fulfill this responsibility and to take corrective actions as mandated by ICH GCP E6 R2 Section 5.1.3, which requires sponsors to ensure that all parties involved in conducting a trial are adequately informed about the trial-related duties and responsibilities. An incorrect approach that involves overlooking the observation due to time constraints or pressure to meet deadlines represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This directly contravenes ICH GCP E6 R2 Section 2.1, which emphasizes that a trial should be conducted in accordance with the protocol and with GCP. Ignoring a potential deviation undermines the scientific validity of the trial's results and jeopardizes patient safety, violating the core ethical principles of beneficence and non-maleficence. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to rectify the deviation independently without proper documentation or consultation, is also professionally unacceptable. It bypasses established quality control procedures and could lead to further errors or an incomplete understanding of the deviation's impact. GCP E6 R2 Section 4.1.3 states that the sponsor should establish a system for trial management and monitoring that complies with the requirements of GCP and that is appropriate for the complexity and scale of the trial. Independent action without involving the designated trial management and monitoring functions fails to adhere to this requirement. Finally, an approach that involves downplaying the significance of the observation to the investigator without initiating a formal process is ethically unsound. While maintaining a collaborative relationship with investigators is important, the medical affairs specialist's primary responsibility is to uphold GCP standards. GCP E6 R2 Section 2.8.1 states that the investigator is responsible for the conduct of the trial at the trial site. However, the sponsor, and by extension, the medical affairs team representing the sponsor, has oversight responsibilities to ensure the trial is conducted ethically and in accordance with GCP. Failing to report a potential deviation to the appropriate oversight bodies abdicates this responsibility. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Recognize and document the potential deviation. 2. Assess the potential impact on patient safety and data integrity. 3. Consult relevant internal policies and GCP guidelines. 4. Escalate the issue promptly to the designated internal experts, e.g., clinical operations, data management, ethics committee liaison. 5. Cooperate fully with any subsequent investigation and corrective action plan. This structured approach ensures that all potential GCP violations are addressed rigorously and ethically. Question 3. During the evaluation of a global medical affairs strategy for a new oncology therapeutic, a medical affairs director needs to ensure that all planned scientific exchange activities and the dissemination of clinical data are compliant with the relevant regulatory frameworks. Considering the primary markets for this product are the United States and the European Union, which approach best ensures adherence to the distinct regulatory requirements. Option A. Prioritize the regulatory framework of the company's headquarters country, assuming this will provide sufficient guidance for all international markets. Option B. Create a unified communication plan that leverages general principles of scientific integrity and ethical engagement, without specific reference to FDA or EMA guidelines. Option C. Develop a single, overarching strategy based on the most stringent global standards, assuming this will satisfy all regional requirements. Option D. Design a comprehensive strategy that explicitly addresses and incorporates the specific regulations and guidance documents issued by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, for the U.S. market, and by the European Medicines Agency, EMA, and relevant national competent authorities for the EU market. The correct answer is C. Develop a single overarching strategy based on the most stringent global standards, assuming this will satisfy all regional requirements. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because medical affairs professionals often operate at the intersection of scientific data, regulatory compliance, and commercial strategy. The need to understand and apply different regulatory frameworks, such as those of the FDA and EMA, is paramount when developing global strategies for product communication and engagement. Misinterpreting or misapplying these frameworks can lead to significant compliance issues, reputational damage, and delays in bringing vital information to healthcare professionals and patients. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all activities are compliant with the specific regulations of each target market. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a thorough understanding of the distinct regulatory landscapes governing pharmaceutical product promotion and information dissemination in major markets like the US and Europe. By acknowledging and addressing the specific requirements of both the FDA e.g., prescription drug advertising regulations, FDA guidance on off-label promotion, and the EMA e.g., EU directives on medicinal products for human use, specific member state regulations, a medical affairs professional ensures that global strategies are not only scientifically sound, but also legally compliant in each relevant jurisdiction. This proactive and jurisdiction-specific approach minimizes risk and maximizes the potential for effective and ethical engagement with stakeholders. An incorrect approach that fails to differentiate between FDA and EMA requirements would be professionally unacceptable due to specific regulatory and ethical failures. For instance, applying U.S. FDA regulations directly to EMA-governed markets could lead to non-compliance with EU directives that may have different standards for advertising, promotional claims, and data presentation. This could result in warning letters, fines, or even product withdrawal in those regions. Conversely, assuming EMA standards are sufficient for the U.S. market would ignore the stringent requirements of the FDA, potentially leading to unauthorized promotion or misrepresentation of product information, which carries severe penalties. Relying solely on internal company policies without explicit consideration of the governing regulatory bodies is also a failure, as internal policies must be built upon and adhere to external legal and regulatory mandates. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of the target markets and their respective regulatory authorities. This includes identifying the primary regulatory bodies, e.g., FDA for the U.S., EMA and national competent authorities for the EU, researching their specific guidelines and regulations pertaining to medical affairs activities, e.g., promotional materials, scientific exchange, data dissemination, and consulting with legal and regulatory experts for each jurisdiction. A risk-based assessment should then inform the development of strategies that are compliant across all relevant markets, with clear documentation of the rationale for any differences in approach. Question 4. Stakeholder feedback indicates that the current process for site initiation in clinical trials is experiencing significant delays, impacting the overall study timelines. As a medical affairs specialist, what is the most appropriate approach to optimize this process while ensuring adherence to U.S. regulatory frameworks and ethical standards? Option A. Focus on streamlining communication channels by centralizing all site initiation documentation requests through a single point of contact, without a formal review of the underlying process steps. Option B. Implement a phased approach to process optimization, beginning with a thorough data analysis of current bottlenecks, followed by the development and pilot testing of revised procedures with key stakeholders, and culminating in a comprehensive validation and training program before full-scale rollout. Option C. Prioritize feedback from the most vocal stakeholders and implement their suggested changes to the site initiation process without conducting a formal data analysis or pilot study. Option D. Immediately revise the site initiation checklist to remove any steps deemed less critical by internal teams, prioritizing speed to get sites activated as quickly as possible. Correct answer is B. Implement a phased approach to process optimization, beginning with a thorough data analysis of current bottlenecks, followed by the development and pilot testing of revised procedures with key stakeholders, and culminating in a comprehensive validation and training program before full-scale rollout. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for efficient clinical research processes with strict adherence to regulatory requirements and ethical considerations. The medical affairs specialist must navigate conflicting priorities, ensuring that process optimization does not compromise data integrity, patient safety, or regulatory compliance. The pressure to accelerate timelines, often driven by commercial interests or unmet medical needs, can create a temptation to bypass established protocols. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, data-driven, and collaborative method for process optimization. This involves thoroughly understanding the current process, identifying bottlenecks through objective data, and developing solutions that are validated and compliant with relevant regulations. Specifically, in the U.S. context, this aligns with the principles of good clinical practice, GCP, as outlined by the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, which emphasize the integrity of clinical trial data and the protection of human subjects. A phased approach, including pilot testing and stakeholder engagement, ensures that any changes are robust, well-received, and unlikely to introduce new risks or compliance issues. This proactive and evidence-based strategy minimizes the likelihood of regulatory noncompliance and maintains the trust of all parties involved in the research. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on speed without adequate validation or regulatory review poses significant risks. For instance, implementing changes based on anecdotal feedback without a thorough root cause analysis or pilot testing could lead to unintended consequences, such as increased errors, data discrepancies, or protocol deviations. This would be a failure to adhere to FDA regulations concerning the conduct of clinical trials, potentially jeopardizing the validity of the research and leading to regulatory scrutiny. Another incorrect approach might involve prioritizing stakeholder convenience over regulatory requirements. This could manifest as overlooking essential documentation steps or simplifying complex procedures in a way that compromises data quality or patient privacy, directly contravening FDA guidelines and ethical principles. Such actions could result in the rejection of trial data, significant delays, or even legal repercussions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the feedback. Clearly define the nature and source of the stakeholder feedback. 2. Assess the impact. Evaluate the potential consequences of the identified issues on research timeline. Data integrity, patient safety, and regulatory compliance. 3. Gather data. Collect objective data to understand the root causes of any inefficiencies or problems. 4. Identify solutions. Brainstorm potential solutions that address the root causes. 5. Evaluate solutions against regulatory and ethical standards. Critically assess each potential solution for compliance with FDA regulations e.g. 21 CFR Parts 50, 56, 312 and ethical guidelines. 6. Develop a phased implementation plan. If a solution is deemed viable, create a plan that includes pilot testing, validation, and comprehensive training. 7. Engage stakeholders. Communicate proposed changes and their rationale to all relevant stakeholders, seeking their input and buy-in. 8. Monitor and refine. Continuously monitor the implemented changes and be prepared to make adjustments based on ongoing data and feedback. Question 5. Consider a scenario where a medical affairs team is tasked with conducting a systematic review and meta-analysis to inform the development of a new medical strategy for an oncology product. The team has identified a substantial body of literature, including both positive and negative study outcomes. The project lead suggests focusing the review primarily on studies that demonstrate a statistically significant benefit of the product, with the rationale that this will expedite the process and provide the most compelling data for internal stakeholders. What is the most appropriate approach for the medical affairs team to undertake in this situation? Option A. Select only those studies that have been published in high-impact factor journals, as these are presumed to be of higher quality and more likely to reflect the product's true efficacy, and exclude studies from less prestigious sources even if they are methodologically sound. Option B. Focus on a rapid literature search of readily available abstracts and summaries, and proceed with a meta-analysis based on the most easily accessible positive results to meet the tight deadline for strategic planning. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive systematic review and meta-analysis adhering strictly to the PRISMA guidelines, ensuring all relevant studies are identified, screened, and critically appraised, regardless of their outcome, and transparently report all findings, including those that do not support the desired conclusion. Option D. Prioritize the inclusion of studies demonstrating statistically significant benefits, while downplaying or omitting studies with non-significant or negative findings, to create a more favorable and concise evidence summary for internal decision-making. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive systematic review and meta-analysis adhering strictly to the PRISMA guidelines, ensuring all relevant studies are identified, screened, and critically appraised, regardless of their outcome, and transparently report all findings, including those that do not support the desired conclusion. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical affairs, ensuring the scientific rigor and ethical presentation of systematic reviews and meta-analyses, particularly when they inform product strategy or communication. The core tension lies in balancing the desire for a comprehensive and impactful analysis with the imperative to adhere to established guidelines for evidence synthesis and reporting. The correct approach emphasizes adherence to the PRISMA, preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Statement. This is best professional practice because PRISMA provides a standardized framework for reporting systematic reviews and meta-analyses, ensuring transparency, completeness, and reproducibility. Following PRISMA guidelines demonstrates a commitment to scientific integrity and facilitates critical appraisal by peers and regulatory bodies. It directly addresses the need for clear methodology, comprehensive search strategies, and unbiased reporting of results, which are fundamental to the credibility of any scientific publication or internal assessment. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on selecting studies that favor a particular outcome, without a predefined, systematic search and selection process, represents a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This practice is often termed cherry-picking and violates principles of scientific objectivity and data integrity. It can lead to biased conclusions, misrepresentation of the evidence base, and potentially harmful decisions based on incomplete or skewed information. Such an approach undermines the trustworthiness of the medical affairs function and can have serious implications for patient safety and regulatory compliance. Another incorrect approach, which involves omitting relevant studies that do not support a desired conclusion, is equally problematic. This omission is a form of bias that distorts the overall picture presented by the available evidence. It fails to acknowledge the full scope of research, thereby misleading stakeholders and potentially leading to suboptimal strategic decisions. Regulatory bodies and scientific journals expect a thorough and unbiased assessment of all relevant literature, not a curated selection. Finally, an approach that prioritizes speed and ease of execution over methodological rigor, such as using a superficial literature search or failing to conduct a critical appraisal of included studies, also constitutes a failure. While efficiency is valued, it cannot come at the expense of scientific validity. A flawed systematic review or meta-analysis, even if conducted quickly, provides unreliable data and can lead to erroneous conclusions, posing risks to the organization and its stakeholders. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of the principles of evidence synthesis, a commitment to established reporting guidelines like PRISMA, and a proactive approach to identifying and mitigating potential biases. Medical affairs professionals must prioritize scientific integrity, transparency, and ethical conduct in all their activities, ensuring that their work is robust, reliable, and defensible. Question 6. The review process indicates that the company's current post-marketing surveillance system for a newly approved pharmaceutical product in the United States relies heavily on passive reporting of adverse events from healthcare professionals and lacks a structured approach for proactive signal detection from other data sources. Given the U.S. FDA's regulatory framework, what is the most appropriate implementation strategy to enhance the company's pharmacovigilance capabilities and ensure compliance? Option A. Implement a multifaceted surveillance strategy that integrates spontaneous adverse event reports with proactive monitoring of scientific literature, patient registries, and real-world data sources, coupled with a defined signal detection and evaluation process aligned with FDA guidance. Option B. Delay the enhancement of the surveillance system until a significant safety concern is formally raised by the FDA or a major adverse event occurs. Option C. Increase the frequency of internal meetings to discuss any adverse event reports received, without altering the primary reliance on passive reporting from healthcare professionals. Option D. Focus resources on developing a comprehensive patient education program about potential side effects, assuming this will indirectly improve signal detection. The correct answer is A. Implement a multifaceted surveillance strategy that integrates spontaneous adverse event reports with proactive monitoring of scientific literature, patient registries, and real-world data sources, coupled with a defined signal detection and evaluation process aligned with FDA guidance. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in pharmacovigilance, balancing the need for timely signal detection with the practicalities of data collection and analysis in a globalized pharmaceutical environment. The challenge lies in ensuring that the company's post-marketing surveillance system is robust enough to identify potential safety issues promptly, while also adhering to the specific regulatory requirements of the target market, which in this case is the United States, governed by the FDA. The complexity arises from the need to integrate diverse data sources, manage varying reporting timelines, and maintain compliance with the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, particularly Title 21. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes proactive engagement with healthcare professionals and a systematic review of multiple data streams, aligning with FDA's expectations for robust post-marketing surveillance. This strategy demonstrates a commitment to identifying potential safety signals early, a core principle of pharmacovigilance. By establishing clear communication channels with prescribers and actively monitoring various data sources, e.g., spontaneous reports, literature, registries, the company is better positioned to detect and assess adverse events, thereby fulfilling its regulatory obligations under 21 CFR Part 314 and 21 CFR Part 600, which mandate ongoing safety monitoring and reporting of adverse experiences. This approach fosters a culture of safety and ensures that the company can respond effectively to emerging safety concerns, protecting public health. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on spontaneous adverse event reporting from healthcare professionals. This is insufficient because it relies on voluntary reporting, which is known to be incomplete and prone to underreporting. It fails to capture a comprehensive safety profile and misses potential signals that may not be immediately recognized as adverse events by the reporting individual. This approach neglects the broader responsibilities outlined in FDA regulations for proactive safety surveillance. Another incorrect approach prioritizes the analysis of large datasets without a clear strategy for signal detection or regulatory reporting. While data analysis is crucial, without a defined methodology for identifying potential safety signals and a framework for reporting them to the FDA as required by 21 CFR Part 314, the analysis becomes an academic exercise rather than a functional pharmacovigilance activity. This approach risks overlooking critical safety information due to a lack of focus on actionable insights. A third incorrect approach involves delaying the implementation of a comprehensive surveillance system until a specific safety signal is identified. This is a reactive and fundamentally flawed strategy. Post-marketing surveillance is intended to be a continuous, proactive process designed to detect signals before they become significant public health issues. Waiting for a signal to emerge before establishing robust systems is a direct contravention of the spirit and letter of FDA regulations, which require ongoing monitoring and a system capable of detecting and assessing potential risks. Professional reasoning. Professionals in medical affairs must adopt a proactive and systematic approach to post-marketing surveillance. This involves understanding the specific regulatory requirements of the target market, in this case, the US FDA, establishing clear processes for data collection and analysis, and fostering strong communication channels with healthcare providers. The decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying all relevant regulatory requirements, e.g., 21 CFR Parts 314-600. 2. Designing a surveillance system that incorporates multiple data sources beyond spontaneous reporting. 3. Establishing clear protocols for signal detection, assessment, and reporting. 4. Ensuring adequate resources and training for the pharmacovigilance team. 5. Regularly reviewing and updating the surveillance system based on evolving regulatory guidance and scientific understanding. Question 7. Which approach would be most compliant with U.S. regulatory frameworks for strategic planning in medical affairs, specifically concerning the engagement of key opinion leaders? Option A. Focus on identifying KOLs with the most extensive publication records and leverage informal channels for gathering insights, assuming that scientific merit negates the need for detailed transactional documentation. Option B. Develop a comprehensive KOL engagement plan that includes clear criteria for KOL identification based on scientific expertise and contribution, defines the scope and purpose of all engagements, ensures compensation reflects fair market value for services rendered, and mandates meticulous documentation of all interactions and associated payments for reporting purposes. Option C. Engage KOLs based on their influence within professional societies and their willingness to share opinions, with minimal emphasis on formal agreements or the tracking of any financial or non-financial benefits provided. Option D. Prioritize building personal relationships with KOLs through frequent, unstructured meetings to foster goodwill and gather anecdotal feedback, without formalizing engagement terms or tracking expenditures. The correct answer is B. Develop a comprehensive KOL engagement plan that includes clear criteria for KOL identification based on scientific expertise and contribution, defines the scope and purpose of all engagements, ensures compensation reflects fair market value for services rendered, and mandates meticulous documentation of all interactions and associated payments for reporting purposes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires medical affairs to balance the strategic imperative of engaging key opinion leaders, call, with the stringent regulatory requirements governing interactions with healthcare professionals, HCP, in the United States. The core tension lies in ensuring that all engagement activities are transparent, compliant with the Sunshine Act, Physician Payments Sunshine Act, and do not create any perception of quid pro quo or undue influence, while still effectively gathering valuable insights and fostering scientific exchange. Missteps can lead to significant reputational damage, financial penalties, and erosion of trust with both HCPs and regulatory bodies. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive, documented, and transparent framework for KOL engagement that is fully aligned with U.S. regulatory requirements. Specifically, it adheres to the Physician Payments Sunshine Act, part of the Affordable Care Act, which mandates reporting of payments and transfers of value made to physicians and teaching hospitals. By establishing clear guidelines for identifying KOLs based on their expertise and scientific contributions, defining the scope and purpose of engagements, ensuring fair market value for services, and meticulously documenting all interactions and associated payments. Medical affairs demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This approach fosters genuine scientific collaboration, builds trust, and mitigates legal and reputational risks. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that focuses solely on identifying KOLs based on their publication record, without considering the regulatory reporting requirements for any associated payments or transfers of value, is professionally unacceptable. This oversight directly violates the spirit and letter of the Physician Payments Sunshine Act, which requires reporting of all such transactions, regardless of the KOL's publication history. It creates a significant risk of non-compliance and potential penalties. An approach that prioritizes informal, undocumented engagements with KOLs to gather insights, even if well-intentioned, is also professionally unacceptable. The lack of documentation makes it impossible to comply with reporting obligations under the Sunshine Act and raises concerns about transparency and potential conflicts of interest. Such an approach undermines the integrity of the engagement process and exposes the organization to regulatory scrutiny. An approach that relies on personal relationships and informal agreements for KOL engagement, without a structured process for identifying needs, defining scope, and ensuring fair market value, is professionally unacceptable. This method is inherently prone to bias, lacks transparency, and fails to meet the documented requirements of the Physician Payments Sunshine Act. It can lead to perceptions of favoritism and noncompliance, jeopardizing the organization's reputation and legal standing. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant U.S. regulatory landscape, particularly the Physician Payments Sunshine Act. This involves proactively identifying all potential interactions with HCPs that could trigger reporting requirements. The next step is to develop a robust, documented, and transparent framework for all KOL engagement activities, ensuring that each engagement has a clear scientific or educational purpose, that compensation is at fair market value, and that all transactions are meticulously recorded. Regular training and updates on regulatory changes are crucial. When faced with engagement opportunities, professionals must ask, does this interaction involve a transfer of value to an HCP? If so, how will it be documented and reported in compliance with the Sunshine Act? This systematic, compliance-first mindset ensures that strategic objectives are met ethically and legally. Question 8. Strategic planning requires the Medical Affairs Department to establish robust key performance indicators, KPI, to measure its effectiveness. Given the evolving regulatory landscape and the imperative to demonstrate value beyond commercial metrics, which of the following approaches to KPI development best aligns with the core mission and ethical obligations of medical affairs? Option A. Prioritizing KPIs that track the volume of product-related inquiries handled by medical information and the number of healthcare professionals engaged in discussions about product data, regardless of the depth or scientific nature of the interaction. Option B. Measuring medical affairs success primarily through metrics that correlate with sales performance and market share growth, assuming that improved scientific understanding will naturally lead to commercial success. Option C. Establishing KPIs based on the number of advisory board meetings held and the perceived satisfaction of participants, without a structured process to ensure balanced representation of scientific viewpoints or independent scientific review of discussions. Option D. Developing KPIs that focus on the number of scientific publications and presentations, the reach and impact of medical education initiatives, and the quality of scientific exchange as assessed by healthcare professional feedback and adherence to scientific accuracy. Correct answer is D. Developing KPIs that focus on the number of scientific publications and presentations, the reach and impact of medical education initiatives, and the quality of scientific exchange as assessed by healthcare professional feedback and adherence to scientific accuracy. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical affairs, aligning internal performance metrics with external stakeholder value and regulatory compliance. The difficulty lies in quantifying the impact of medical affairs activities, which are often qualitative and long-term, in a way that satisfies diverse internal demands, e.g., R&D, commercial and external expectations, e.g., healthcare professionals, payers, while adhering to strict ethical and regulatory guidelines. The core tension is between demonstrating tangible value and maintaining scientific integrity and compliance. The correct approach focuses on establishing KPIs that are directly linked to medical affairs core responsibilities: scientific exchange, evidence generation, and medical education. These KPIs should be measurable, actionable, and reflect the quality and impact of these activities. For example, tracking the number of peer-reviewed publications stemming from investigator-initiated studies, the reach and engagement of medical education programs, and the quality of scientific exchange interactions, as assessed by feedback from healthcare professionals, directly demonstrates the value medical affairs brings to scientific advancement and informed decision-making. This approach aligns with the ethical imperative to provide accurate, balanced, and evidence-based information, and supports the strategic goals of the organization by fostering scientific credibility and improving patient outcomes. It also implicitly adheres to regulations by focusing on scientific merit and educational value rather than promotional activities. An incorrect approach that prioritizes metrics solely based on the volume of interactions, without considering the quality or scientific rigor of the exchange, fails to capture the true value of medical affairs. This could lead to superficial engagement that does not advance scientific understanding or improve patient care, and potentially crosses ethical lines if the focus shifts from scientific exchange to implicit promotion. Another incorrect approach that relies heavily on metrics easily influenced by commercial activities, such as the number of product inquiries handled by medical information, without robust scientific validation or independent assessment, risks creating a perception of bias and can lead to regulatory scrutiny if these metrics are used to infer commercial success rather than scientific support. Focusing on metrics that are difficult to objectively measure or are not directly attributable to medical affairs activities, such as overall market share changes, dilutes the focus on medical affairs' unique contributions and can lead to misallocation of resources and inaccurate performance assessments. These approaches can lead to ethical breaches by prioritizing quantity over quality, potentially leading to misrepresentation of scientific value, and regulatory noncompliance by blurring the lines between medical affairs and promotional activities. The professional decision-making process should involve a collaborative effort between medical affairs leadership, compliance officers, and relevant internal stakeholders to define KPIs that are scientifically sound, ethically defensible, and strategically aligned. This process requires a clear understanding of the regulatory framework governing medical affairs activities, a commitment to scientific integrity, and a focus on demonstrating value through evidence-based engagement and education. Question 9. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of audience misinterpretation of complex pharmacokinetic data during a presentation to a mixed group of oncologists and clinical pharmacists. What is the most appropriate presentation strategy to mitigate this risk? Option A. Focus exclusively on the most statistically significant efficacy endpoints, briefly mentioning pharmacokinetic data as a supporting element without detailed explanation. Option B. Employ highly technical terminology and complex graphical representations to maintain the scientific rigor expected by the audience. Option C. Incorporate clear, concise explanations of key pharmacokinetic parameters. Utilize visual aids that simplify complex relationships without sacrificing accuracy, and allocate time for a cue and a session specifically addressing potential areas of confusion. Option D. Present the raw pharmacokinetic data tables with minimal annotation, assuming the audience's expertise will allow them to interpret the nuances. The correct answer is C. Incorporate clear, concise explanations of key pharmacokinetic parameters. Utilize visual aids that simplify complex relationships without sacrificing accuracy, and allocate time for a cue and a session specifically addressing potential areas of confusion. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need to present complex scientific data effectively with the ethical and regulatory obligations to ensure accuracy, avoid misleading information, and maintain scientific integrity. The audience's diverse backgrounds and potential for misinterpretation necessitate a presentation approach that is both engaging and rigorously compliant. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes clarity, accuracy, and audience comprehension while adhering to regulatory guidelines for scientific exchange. This involves tailoring the presentation to the audience's level of understanding, using clear and concise language, visually representing data effectively, and proactively addressing potential questions or areas of confusion. This aligns with the principles of responsible scientific communication, ensuring that information is conveyed accurately and ethically, fostering informed decision-making by healthcare professionals. It upholds the spirit of scientific exchange by providing balanced and evidence-based information. Incorrect approach is analysis. Presenting highly technical jargon without explanation risks alienating or confusing the audience, potentially leading to misinterpretation of critical data. This failure to ensure comprehension can be seen as a breach of ethical communication, as it does not facilitate informed understanding. It may also inadvertently violate regulatory principles if the lack of clarity leads to a misrepresentation of the scientific evidence. Focusing solely on the most statistically significant findings without contextualizing them or discussing limitations can create a skewed perception of the data. The selective presentation, even if technically accurate in isolation, can be misleading and violate ethical standards by omitting crucial context. It may also fall afoul of regulations requiring fair and balanced representation of scientific information. Using overly simplistic analogies or graphics that do not accurately reflect the scientific nuances can lead to overgeneralization and misunderstanding. While intended to simplify, such an approach can distort the scientific message, which is an ethical failing. It also risks misrepresenting the data, potentially contravening regulatory expectations for scientific accuracy. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured approach to scientific presentations. This involves understanding the audience's expertise, defining clear learning objectives, structuring the content logically, using appropriate language and visuals, and anticipating potential questions. A critical step is to review the presentation against internal compliance guidelines and regulatory expectations for scientific exchange, ensuring that all claims are substantiated and presented in a balanced manner. The goal is to educate and inform, not to persuade through incomplete or misleading information. Question 10. The investigation demonstrates that a pharmaceutical company's medical affairs team is exploring the use of electronic health records, (EHR), and insurance claims data to generate real-world evidence, (RWE), supporting the comparative effectiveness of their novel oncology therapy against established treatments. The team is considering presenting preliminary findings at a medical conference to inform key opinion leaders, (COL), about the potential value proposition. Which of the following approaches best navigates the implementation challenges while adhering to regulatory and ethical standards for RWE generation and dissemination in this context? Option A. Utilize the RWE to directly support promotional claims in marketing materials, as the observed trends in real-world usage suggest a clear benefit that should be communicated to healthcare providers. Option B. Proceed with presenting the preliminary RWE at the medical conference, emphasizing the positive trends observed in the EHR and claims data, while acknowledging that further validation studies are planned. Option C. Develop a comprehensive RWE study protocol, including clear objectives, predefined analytical methods, and a plan for addressing potential biases and limitations of the EHR and claims data before any dissemination of findings. Option D. Focus solely on the RWE derived from EHRs, as this data is considered more clinically granular, and defer the use of claims data due to concerns about its potential for misinterpretation in comparative effectiveness analyses. The correct answer is B. Proceed with presenting the preliminary RWE at the medical conference, emphasizing the positive trends observed in the EHR and claims data, while acknowledging that further validation studies are planned. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a common challenge in medical affairs: the ethical and regulatory complexities of leveraging real-world evidence, RWE, derived from real-world data, RWD, for product differentiation and value demonstration, particularly when the RWD sources are not traditionally validated for clinical trial rigor. The professional challenge lies in balancing the potential benefits of RWE in informing clinical practice and payer discussions with the imperative to ensure data integrity, patient privacy, and adherence to promotional regulations. The need for robust methodologies and transparent reporting is paramount to avoid misinterpretation or misleading claims. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, scientifically sound, and ethically compliant methodology for RWE generation and utilization. This involves clearly defining the research question, selecting appropriate RWD sources with consideration for their limitations, employing rigorous analytical methods to minimize bias, and ensuring that any conclusions drawn are supported by the evidence and presented transparently. Adherence to established guidelines for RWE, G. FDA guidance on RWE for regulatory decision-making, ISPR principles, ensures that the evidence is credible and can be used responsibly in discussions with healthcare professionals and payers. This approach upholds the principles of scientific integrity and ethical communication, crucial for maintaining trust and credibility in medical affairs. An incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal observations or selectively presents RWD without rigorous analysis fails to meet scientific standards and regulatory requirements. This can lead to unsubstantiated claims about product efficacy or comparative effectiveness, potentially violating regulations against misleading promotion. Another incorrect approach that overlooks patient privacy and data security when accessing or analyzing RWD exposes the organization to significant legal and ethical repercussions, including breaches of data protection laws, e.g., HIPAA in the U.S., GDPR in Europe, depending on jurisdiction. Furthermore, an approach that fails to clearly articulate the limitations of the RWD and the RWE-generated risks misinforming stakeholders about the strength and generalizability of the findings, undermining the credibility of medical affairs and the product. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multidisciplinary team including medical affairs, health economics and outcomes research (HEOR), legal and regulatory affairs. This team should collaboratively assess the RWD sources, define the RWE generation plan, and critically evaluate the findings. Key considerations should include the quality and completeness of the RWD, the appropriateness of the analytical methods, the potential for bias, the interpretability of the RWE in the context of the research question, and the regulatory implications of disseminating the findings. A commitment to transparency regarding data sources, methodologies, and limitations is essential throughout the process. Question 11. The monitoring system demonstrates a statistically significant increase in a specific adverse event in the treatment arm compared to the placebo arm of a phase III clinical trial, with a p-value below the predefined threshold for concern. However, the observed events are mild in nature and have resolved without intervention in all reported cases. What is the most appropriate immediate next step for the medical affairs specialist? Option A. Inform regulatory authorities of the statistically significant finding without further internal review, as per the principle of immediate reporting of all statistically significant safety signals. Option B. Immediately recommend halting the clinical trial to the Data Monitoring Committee due to the statistically significant finding, irrespective of the event's severity or resolution. Option C. Initiate a comprehensive review of the adverse event data, including clinical context, causality assessment, and consultation with the clinical and statistical teams to determine the clinical significance and potential impact on the trial. Option D. Proceed with the trial as planned, considering the adverse events to be clinically insignificant due to their mild nature and spontaneous resolution, and not escalate the finding further. The correct answer is C. Initiate a comprehensive review of the adverse event data, including clinical context, causality assessment, and consultation with the clinical and statistical teams to determine the clinical significance and potential impact on the trial. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where a medical affairs specialist must interpret complex biostatistical data in the context of a clinical trial's safety profile. The core dilemma lies in balancing the potential benefits of a new treatment with emerging safety signals, requiring a nuanced understanding of statistical significance versus clinical relevance, and adhering to strict regulatory reporting obligations. The pressure to act decisively while ensuring data integrity and patient safety necessitates a robust ethical and professional framework. Correct approach analysis. The most appropriate approach involves a thorough, multifaceted review of the safety data. This includes not only statistical significance, but also the clinical context of the adverse events, their severity, frequency, and potential causality. Collaborating with the clinical development team, statisticians, and regulatory affairs is crucial to form a comprehensive understanding. This aligns with best professional practice by prioritizing patient safety, ensuring data integrity, and adhering to regulatory requirements for timely and accurate reporting of potential safety issues. The medical affairs specialist's role is to facilitate informed decision-making based on a complete and accurate interpretation of the data, which includes understanding the limitations of statistical findings and their real-world implications. This approach upholds the ethical obligation to protect patient well-being and maintain trust with regulatory bodies and healthcare professionals. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately halt the trial based solely on a statistically significant p-value without further investigation. This fails to consider the clinical relevance of the observed events, the possibility of type I errors, false positives, and the potential impact on patients who might benefit from the treatment. Ethically, this could lead to premature discontinuation of a potentially life-saving therapy without sufficient justification. From a regulatory perspective, such an action without a comprehensive safety assessment could be seen as an overreaction, potentially violating trial protocols and regulatory guidelines that require a thorough evaluation of all available data before making critical decisions. Another incorrect approach would be to downplay or ignore the statistically significant finding, because the observed adverse events are rare or perceived as minor. This approach disregards the fundamental principle of pharmacovigilance, which mandates the investigation of all potential safety signals, regardless of perceived severity or frequency. Regulatory bodies expect proactive identification and assessment of safety concerns. Failing to escalate or thoroughly investigate a statistically significant signal, even if seemingly minor, represents a failure in due diligence and could lead to serious patient harm if the signal represents a genuine, albeit rare, risk. This also undermines the integrity of the data monitoring process and erodes trust with regulatory authorities. A third incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the statistical analysis report without engaging with the clinical and statistical teams for interpretation. Biostatistics provides the quantitative evidence, but the interpretation of that evidence within the clinical trial context requires expert judgment. This approach risks misinterpreting the data, overlooking confounding factors, or failing to grasp the clinical implications of the statistical findings. Ethically, this can lead to flawed decision-making that compromises patient safety. Regulatory frameworks emphasize a holistic review of data, not just isolated statistical outputs. Professional reasoning. When faced with emerging safety signals in clinical trial data, a medical affairs specialist should adopt a systematic and collaborative approach. This involves 1. Acknowledging and validating the statistical finding. 2. Investigating the clinical context of the adverse events, e.g., severity, duration, reversibility, relationship to treatment. 3. Consulting with statisticians to understand the robustness of the finding and potential biases. 4. Engaging with the clinical development team and medical experts to assess clinical significance and potential impact on patient populations. 5. Evaluating the data against predefined safety endpoints and stopping rules. 6. Documenting all findings and discussions thoroughly. 7. Communicating transparently and promptly with relevant stakeholders, including regulatory authorities, as per established protocols and guidelines. This structured process ensures that decisions are data-driven, ethically sound, and compliant with regulatory expectations, prioritizing patient safety above all else. Question 12. Performance analysis shows that a recently launched oncology product is significantly underperforming against its initial sales forecasts. Medical Affairs has been tasked with developing a strategy to address this gap. The team has gathered initial feedback suggesting that some oncologists are hesitant to prescribe the product due to perceived complexity in its administration and a lack of clarity on its comparative efficacy against established treatments in specific patient subgroups. Which of the following approaches best represents a compliant and effective medical affairs strategy to address this underperformance? Option A. Launch a targeted direct-to-consumer advertising campaign to raise patient awareness of the product's existence and potential benefits, and equip the sales force with materials that encourage patients to ask their physicians about the new treatment option. Option B. Focus on generating real-world evidence studies that specifically target patient populations where the product has shown the most promising, albeit preliminary, efficacy signals, and proactively engage with regulatory bodies to explore potential label expansions based on these emerging findings. Option C. Develop and disseminate new educational materials that highlight the product's novel mechanism of action and potential long-term benefits, while also initiating a series of peer-to-peer discussions with key opinion leaders to share their positive early experiences and address perceived administration challenges. Option D. Increase the frequency of sales representative visits to oncology practices, providing them with updated talking points that emphasize the product's superiority over competitors based on preliminary data, and encourage them to offer additional financial incentives for early adoption. The correct answer is C. Develop and disseminate new educational materials that highlight the product's novel mechanism of action and potential long-term benefits, while also initiating a series of peer-to-peer discussions with key opinion leaders to share their positive early experiences and address perceived administration challenges. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical affairs where a new product launch is underperforming against initial projections. The challenge lies in identifying the root causes of this underperformance and formulating a strategic response that is both effective and compliant with regulatory and ethical standards. Medical affairs professionals must navigate the complexities of market dynamics, physician engagement, and data interpretation, while adhering strictly to the guidelines governing pharmaceutical promotion and scientific exchange. The pressure to meet commercial targets can create a temptation to overstep boundaries, making ethical and regulatory vigilance paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive, data-driven assessment of the product's performance, focusing on objective metrics and insights from key stakeholders. This includes analyzing prescriber feedback, understanding the competitive landscape, and evaluating the effectiveness of existing medical education initiatives. The strategy should then be refined based on these findings, prioritizing evidence-based communication and education that addresses unmet needs and clarifies the product's value proposition. This aligns with the core responsibilities of medical affairs to ensure accurate and balanced scientific information is disseminated, fostering appropriate use of the product and supporting patient care, all within the bounds of regulatory frameworks like those governing the pharmaceutical industry in the United States. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that focuses solely on increasing promotional activities without a thorough understanding of the underlying issues is problematic. This could lead to misdirected efforts, potential noncompliance with FDA regulations regarding off-label promotion or unsubstantiated claims, and a failure to address genuine barriers to adoption. It prioritizes commercial outcomes over scientific accuracy and patient benefit. Another incorrect approach would be to solely rely on anecdotal evidence from a small group of key opinion leaders without broader market validation. This can lead to biased insights and strategies that do not reflect the wider prescriber base or patient population, potentially resulting in ineffective or even misleading medical education. It risks violating ethical principles of scientific integrity and fairness. A third incorrect approach might involve shifting resources to develop new marketing materials that emphasize secondary endpoints or less robust data without a clear medical rationale or prior scientific publication. This could be interpreted as an attempt to create a more favorable perception of the product than the data fully supports, potentially contravening FDA guidelines on fair balance and the accurate representation of clinical trial results. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, evidence-based approach. This involves 1. Defining clear performance metrics and benchmarks. 2. Conducting a thorough root cause analysis using both quantitative and qualitative data. 3. Engaging with internal stakeholders, e.g., commercial, regulatory, and external stakeholders, e.g., physicians, patient advocacy groups, to gather diverse perspectives. 4. Developing strategic recommendations that are aligned with the product's approved label and supported by robust scientific evidence. 5. Ensuring all proposed activities are reviewed for compliance with relevant U.S. regulations, e.g., FDA, PHRMA code, and ethical guidelines. This structured process ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and prioritize patient well-being and scientific integrity. Question 13. System analysis indicates that a medical affairs team is tasked with conducting a comprehensive competitive landscape analysis for an upcoming product launch. The team needs to understand competitor strategies, pipeline developments, and market positioning. What is the most appropriate and compliant approach for gathering this critical intelligence? Option A. Engage in discussions with former employees of competitor companies to gather insights into their product development strategies and unapproved indications. Option B. Utilize market research firms that specialize in obtaining proprietary and non-public information about competitor R&D pipelines and sales forecasts. Option C. Actively seek out and discuss off-label uses of competitor products with healthcare professionals during scientific exchange, framing it as understanding the current treatment landscape. Option D. Monitor publicly available information, including scientific publications, conference presentations, regulatory filings, and official company press releases, to inform the analysis. The correct answer is A. Engage in discussions with former employees of competitor companies to gather insights into their product development strategies and unapproved indications. Explanation. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in competitive landscape analysis for a medical affairs professional operating within the U.S. regulatory framework. The core challenge lies in balancing the need for comprehensive competitive intelligence with strict adherence to FDA regulations and ethical guidelines concerning off-label promotion and fair competition. Medical affairs must gather information to inform strategic planning, but the methods employed must not cross the line into soliciting or disseminating off-label information or engaging in unfair competitive practices. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes compliant data gathering and analysis. By focusing on publicly available information, published scientific literature, and official company communications, the medical affairs professional ensures that the competitive landscape analysis is built on a foundation of transparency and regulatory adherence. This approach allows for a robust understanding of competitor activities without engaging in prohibited discussions or actions. It upholds the principles of fair competition and prevents the dissemination of potentially misleading or unapproved information. An incorrect approach that involves directly soliciting information about a competitor's unapproved indications from their former employees or engaging in discussions about off-label uses of competitor products represents significant regulatory and ethical failures. Specifically, soliciting information about unapproved indications from former employees could be construed as an attempt to gain proprietary information through unethical means, potentially violating trade secret laws and FDA regulations regarding the promotion of unapproved drugs. Discussing off-label uses of competitor products, even in an analytical context, risks crossing into off-label promotion, which is strictly prohibited by the FDA. This can lead to severe penalties for the company and reputational damage. Furthermore, such actions undermine the integrity of the competitive analysis by relying on potentially biased or illegally obtained information. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the regulatory boundaries set by the FDA, particularly concerning off-label promotion and fair competition. Medical affairs professionals must develop a framework that includes 1. Identifying all potential sources of competitive intelligence. 2. Rigorously evaluating each source for compliance with FDA regulations and ethical standards. 3. Prioritizing publicly available and scientifically validated information. And 4. Establishing clear internal guidelines and training for the team on what constitutes acceptable and unacceptable methods of competitive intelligence gathering. When in doubt, consulting with legal and regulatory affairs departments is paramount. Question 14. The evaluation methodology shows that a medical affairs specialist is responsible for triaging incoming adverse event (AE) reports from various sources, including healthcare professionals, patients, and internal company personnel. The specialist receives a report of a serious adverse event (SAE) that is suspected to be related to the investigational product. However, some critical pieces of information, such as the patient's full medical history and the exact dosage administered, are missing from the initial report. The specialist must decide on the immediate course of action regarding regulatory reporting. Which of the following approaches best aligns with U.S. regulatory requirements and best practices for handling this situation? Option A. Report the serious adverse event to the FDA only after confirming a definitive causal relationship between the event and the investigational product through further investigation. Option B. Focus on analyzing the aggregate trends of adverse events from post-marketing surveillance data and report the serious adverse event only if it appears to be a significant outlier in the aggregated data. Option C. Delay reporting the serious adverse event to the FDA until all missing information, including the full medical history and exact dosage, has been obtained and verified. Option D. Immediately submit a preliminary report of the serious adverse event to the FDA, noting the missing information and committing to providing the additional details as soon as they become available. The correct answer is D. Immediately submit a preliminary report of the serious adverse event to the FDA, noting the missing information and committing to providing the additional details as soon as they become available. Explanation: the evaluation methodology shows a critical need for a robust and compliant adverse event (AE) reporting system within a pharmaceutical company. The professional challenge lies in balancing the urgency of patient safety with the meticulous adherence to regulatory timelines and data integrity requirements. Missteps in AE reporting can lead to significant regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and most importantly, potential harm to patients if critical safety information is not communicated effectively and promptly to regulatory authorities. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes immediate, accurate, and complete reporting of all suspected adverse events to the relevant regulatory authorities within the stipulated timeframes, as mandated by the FDA's Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, Title 21, Part 314 for approved drugs and Part 600 for biologics, and relevant ICH guidelines e.g. E2A. This includes establishing clear internal processes for AE identification, assessment, documentation, and expedited submission of serious and unexpected adverse events, SUSAR. Ethical considerations also demand transparency and proactive communication of potential risks to ensure patient well-being and maintain public trust. An incorrect approach that involves delaying reporting due to incomplete information, while understandable from an operational perspective, represents a significant regulatory failure. The FDA's regulations require reporting of suspected adverse events, not just confirmed ones, and often have strict timelines for initial reports, even if further investigation is ongoing. Failing to report within these mandated timelines constitutes a violation of 21 CFR 314, 80 and 314, 98, potentially leading to enforcement actions. Another incorrect approach, such as only reporting AEs that are definitively proven to be causally related to the product, is also a regulatory failure. The term suspected is key in AE reporting. The company has a responsibility to report any event that is reasonably suspected of being associated with the product, regardless of whether causality has been definitively established. This aligns with the principles of pharmacovigilance and the intent of regulations like 21 CFR 314, 80, F, which defines what constitutes an adverse drug experience requiring reporting. Finally, an approach that relies solely on post-marketing surveillance data without a proactive reporting mechanism for individual case safety reports, ICSR, would also be a failure. Regulations require the establishment and maintenance of a system to collect, evaluate, and report adverse experiences, not just to analyze aggregated data. The professional decision-making process for handling adverse event reporting should involve a clear understanding of regulatory requirements, a commitment to patient safety, and the establishment of robust internal standard operating procedures, SOP. When an AE is identified, the immediate steps should be to assess its seriousness and expectedness, gather all available information, and initiate the reporting process according to established timelines, even if some details are still pending. A tiered reporting system, where certain events require immediate reporting and others can be reported with less urgency but still within regulatory limits, is crucial. Continuous training of personnel involved in AE detection and reporting is also paramount to ensure compliance and best practice. Question 15. Compliance review shows that a medical science liaison, MSL, received an unsolicited request from a healthcare professional, HCP, seeking detailed scientific information and clinical data regarding an investigational use of an approved product that is not listed on the product's current approved label. The MSL is considering how to respond. Which of the following represents the most compliant and professionally appropriate course of action? Option A. Provide the HCP with copies of relevant peer-reviewed publications that discuss the investigational use, along with the approved product labeling, and inform them that this is the extent of information that can be shared regarding this topic. Option B. Directly provide the HCP with a comprehensive summary of internal clinical trial data that supports the investigational use, even if this data has not yet been published. Option C. Advise the HCP to contact the company's sales representative, as they may have access to additional information regarding the investigational use. Option D. Inform the HCP that the company cannot provide any information related to off-label uses of its products and politely decline to answer the question. The correct answer is A. Provide the HCP with copies of relevant peer-reviewed publications that discuss the investigational use, along with the approved product labeling, and inform them that this is the extent of information that can be shared regarding this topic. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical affairs where a medical science liaison, MSL, receives an unsolicited request for off-label information from a healthcare professional, HCP. The challenge lies in balancing the MSL's role in providing scientific information with the strict regulatory requirements governing drug promotion and the dissemination of information outside approved labeling. The MSL must navigate this without appearing to promote the drug for an unapproved use, which could lead to significant compliance violations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves acknowledging the request and then directing the HCP to the approved product labeling and any publicly available scientific literature that supports the off-label use. This adheres to regulatory guidelines by ensuring that any information provided is based on approved sources and is not a direct endorsement or promotion of the off-label indication by the company. It respects the HCP's need for information while maintaining strict compliance with promotional regulations. This approach upholds the principle of providing balanced, evidence-based information through appropriate channels. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to directly provide detailed scientific information supporting the off-label use, even if it is based on published data. This is a regulatory failure because it can be construed as promoting the drug for an unapproved indication, which is strictly prohibited. The company is not permitted to disseminate information that encourages or facilitates off-label use. Another incorrect approach is to decline to provide any information whatsoever, stating that the request is for off-label use and no information can be shared. A caution is necessary. A complete refusal can be professionally unhelpful and may not align with the spirit of scientific exchange. The regulatory framework often allows for the provision of certain types of information, such as responding to unsolicited requests with approved labeling and publicly available data, rather than a blanket refusal. A third incorrect approach is to suggest that the HCP consult with a company medical advisor for the off-label information. This is a significant compliance failure, as it attempts to circumvent direct communication with the HCP about off-label use by involving another internal resource, which can still be interpreted as company-sponsored promotion of off-label use. The responsibility for handling such requests typically falls to the MSL, who must do so compliantly. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. When faced with an unsolicited request for off-label information, the first step is to identify the nature of the request and its potential regulatory implications. The MSL should then consult internal policies and guidelines regarding the handling of off-label inquiries. The core principle is to respond in a manner that is truthful, balanced, and non-promotional, relying on approved sources and publicly available scientific data, while avoiding any direct encouragement or facilitation of off-label use. This involves a careful assessment of what information can be shared and through which channels, always erring on the side of caution and strict adherence to regulatory requirements. Question 16. Implementation of a new oncology therapeutic agent requires a comprehensive communication strategy. The medical affairs team is tasked with developing materials and engagement plans for 3 distinct stakeholder groups: oncologists, patients undergoing treatment, and health insurance formulary committees. Which of the following approaches best ensures effective and compliant communication for each group? Option A. Focus primarily on patient testimonials and anecdotal evidence of treatment success to build enthusiasm among oncologists and payers, as this is often the most compelling form of communication. Option B. Create distinct communication materials for each stakeholder group. a peer-reviewed publication and presentation for oncologists, patient-friendly brochures and online resources focusing on treatment benefits and side effect management for patients, and a health economic dossier with comparative effectiveness data for formulary committees. Option C. Provide oncologists with detailed clinical data, but present patients with simplified marketing claims and omit specific details about potential adverse events to avoid causing undue concern. Option D. Develop a single, detailed scientific monograph outlining all clinical trial data, mechanism of action, and safety information, and distribute it universally to all three stakeholder groups. The correct answer is D. Develop a single, detailed scientific monograph outlining all clinical trial data, mechanism of action, and safety information, and distribute it universally to all three stakeholder groups. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical affairs, effectively communicating complex scientific data to diverse audiences with varying levels of medical expertise and distinct information needs. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that the core scientific message is accurately conveyed while being tailored to resonate with each stakeholder group, adhering to regulatory guidelines and ethical principles. Missteps can lead to misinterpretation, noncompliance, and ultimately, suboptimal patient outcomes or market access challenges. The correct approach prioritizes understanding the unique information requirements and communication preferences of each stakeholder. For healthcare professionals (HCP), the focus is on robust clinical data, mechanism of action, efficacy, safety profiles, and comparative effectiveness, presented in a scientifically rigorous manner. For patients, the emphasis shifts to understandable language, focusing on benefits, risks, how the treatment works in practical terms, and adherence support, often requiring simplified visuals and relatable examples. For payers, the key concerns are value, cost-effectiveness, budget impact, and evidence supporting clinical utility within a healthcare system, often requiring health economic data and real-world evidence. This tailored approach ensures that each stakeholder receives the most relevant and actionable information, fostering informed decision-making and appropriate use of the medical product. This aligns with regulatory expectations for clear, accurate, and balanced communication, as well as ethical obligations to provide information that supports patient well-being and responsible resource allocation. An incorrect approach would involve using a one-size-fits-all communication strategy. For instance, presenting highly technical clinical trial data directly to patients without simplification would be overwhelming and potentially misleading, failing to meet their need for understandable information and potentially violating principles of patient-centric communication. Similarly, providing only patient-focused benefit messaging to payers without robust economic and clinical utility data would fail to address their core concerns about value and resource allocation, potentially leading to market access barriers and violating principles of transparent value demonstration. Using overly promotional language or omitting critical safety information when communicating with any stakeholder group would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure, violating guidelines on fair balance and potentially engaging in off-label promotion. The professional decision-making process should involve a thorough understanding of the product's scientific profile, the specific objectives of the communication, and a deep dive into the information needs, literacy levels, and preferred communication channels of each target stakeholder group. This requires cross-functional collaboration with marketing, market access, and regulatory affairs to ensure alignment and compliance. A robust medical affairs strategy will involve developing distinct communication plans and materials for each stakeholder, validated for clarity, accuracy, and compliance before dissemination. Question 17. Operational review demonstrates that a prominent physician has submitted a request for a significant educational grant to support a research project focused on a novel therapeutic area where the company has a strong interest. The physician is well respected but has not previously collaborated with the company. The medical affairs team is eager to support this research, given its potential to advance understanding in a key area. What is the most ethically sound and compliant approach for the medical affairs team to manage this grant request? Option A. The medical affairs team should establish a clear, documented process for evaluating the grant request based on scientific merit, educational value, and alignment with established company policies, ensuring an independent review by a designated committee or personnel. Option B. The medical affairs team should engage directly with the physician to provide input on refining the research proposal to better align with the company's strategic interests before the formal review process begins. Option C. The medical affairs team should approve the grant request immediately due to the physician's esteemed reputation and the project's alignment with the company's therapeutic focus, bypassing a formal review to expedite the process. Option D. The medical affairs team should approve the grant, but only after the research is completed to ensure the company is funding a proven outcome. Correct answer is B. The medical affairs team should engage directly with the physician to provide input on refining the research proposal to better align with the company's strategic interests before the formal review process begins. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common ethical challenge in medical affairs, where a potential conflict of interest arises from a company-sponsored educational grant. The challenge lies in balancing the legitimate need for scientific exchange and education with the imperative to avoid any perception or reality of influencing prescribing behavior or research outcomes through financial support. Medical affairs professionals must navigate this delicate balance with utmost integrity, ensuring transparency and adherence to ethical guidelines and regulatory frameworks. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes transparency, independent scientific review, and adherence to established guidelines for grant allocation. This involves a clear, documented process for evaluating grant requests based on scientific merit and alignment with the company's medical objectives, free from undue influence. It ensures that funding decisions are objective and that the educational activities supported are genuinely for the advancement of medical knowledge and patient care, thereby upholding the ethical principles of medical affairs and complying with relevant regulations. This approach fosters trust with healthcare professionals and institutions. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that involves direct engagement with the requesting physician to guide their research proposal or educational content before the grant review process is ethically flawed. This suggests a predetermination of the outcome and blurs the lines between legitimate support and potential undue influence, violating principles of scientific independence and potentially contravening regulations related to interactions with healthcare professionals. Another incorrect approach is to approve the grant solely based on the physician's reputation or past collaborations without a formal, objective review of the proposal's scientific merit and educational value. This bypasses essential due diligence, creating a risk of funding suboptimal or biased research/education, and can be perceived as favoritism, undermining the integrity of the grant program and the medical affairs function. Finally, an approach that involves approving the grant without any documentation of the review process or the rationale for approval is problematic. Lack of transparency and documentation can lead to perceptions of impropriety and makes it difficult to defend the decision if questioned, potentially violating internal policies and external compliance requirements. Professional reasoning. Medical affairs professionals should adopt a structured, transparent, and objective approach to managing educational grants. This involves establishing clear policies and procedures for grant applications, review, and approval. Key steps include: 1. Independent review of grant proposals based on predefined scientific and educational criteria. 2. Disclosure of any potential conflicts of interest among reviewers. 3. A documented decision-making process. 4. Ensuring that funded activities are conducted independently by the recipient. 5. Maintaining records of all grant-related activities. This systematic process safeguards against ethical breaches and regulatory noncompliance, ensuring that medical affairs activities genuinely contribute to scientific advancement and patient well-being. Question 18. Investigation of the most appropriate decision-making framework for allocating a limited medical affairs budget to support a new product launch, considering the need for robust scientific evidence generation and market access, while adhering to strict regulatory and ethical standards. Option A. Fund a broad range of smaller, less scientifically rigorous studies to maximize the number of data points generated, regardless of their potential for impactful dissemination. Option B. Focus budget allocation on initiatives that offer the quickest path to demonstrating product differentiation, even if the scientific evidence is preliminary and requires further validation. Option C. Prioritize research initiatives with the highest potential for peer-reviewed publication and presentation at major scientific congresses, ensuring alignment with identified, unmet medical needs and the product's scientific profile. Option D. Allocate the majority of the budget to initiatives that directly support sales and marketing efforts, focusing on rapid generation of data that can be used in promotional materials. The correct answer is C. Prioritize research initiatives with the highest potential for peer-reviewed publication and presentation at major scientific congresses, ensuring alignment with identified, unmet medical needs and the product's scientific profile. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical affairs, balancing the strategic imperative of evidence generation with the practical constraints of budget allocation. The Medical Affairs Department is tasked with supporting a new product launch, which necessitates robust data to inform healthcare professionals and payers. However, the available budget is limited, forcing difficult decisions about which research initiatives to prioritize. The challenge lies in selecting initiatives that offer the greatest scientific and clinical value, align with the product's strategic objectives, and adhere to all relevant regulatory and ethical guidelines, all while demonstrating fiscal responsibility. The correct approach prioritizes initiatives that directly address critical data gaps identified through thorough scientific and market analysis, and that are designed to generate high-quality evidence suitable for publication in peer-reviewed journals and presentation at scientific congresses. This aligns with the core responsibilities of medical affairs to advance scientific understanding and support appropriate use of medicine. It also reflects a commitment to ethical research practices by focusing on scientifically sound methodologies and transparent data dissemination, which is paramount under regulatory frameworks governing pharmaceutical promotion and evidence generation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on initiatives with immediate, short-term commercial impact, without a strong scientific rationale or plan for rigorous data dissemination, fails to uphold the scientific integrity expected of medical affairs. This could lead to regulatory scrutiny for potentially promotional activities disguised as medical education or research. Another incorrect approach that neglects to consider the long-term strategic value of an initiative, opting instead for less impactful but less expensive studies, may hinder the product's scientific positioning and market access. Furthermore, the approach that bypasses internal review processes or fails to ensure compliance with ethical guidelines for research and data reporting would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure, potentially leading to reputational damage and legal repercussions. The professional decision-making process should involve a structured evaluation of proposed initiatives based on scientific merit, clinical relevance, alignment with strategic objectives, potential for publication and dissemination, and budget feasibility. This evaluation should be conducted collaboratively with key internal stakeholders and adhere to established internal policies and external regulatory requirements. A robust framework for assessing return on investment, not just in financial terms but also in scientific and clinical impact, is crucial. Question 19. The evaluation methodology shows that a medical affairs team is planning a global scientific exchange initiative. To ensure compliance, what is the most appropriate approach when developing communication materials and engagement strategies for healthcare professionals in both the United States and the European Union? Option A. Prioritize the regulatory framework of the region with the largest market share for the company's products, assuming it will encompass the majority of compliance needs for other regions. Option B. Develop a single, comprehensive set of materials and engagement protocols that adhere to the strictest common regulatory principles found across both the FDA and EMA frameworks. Option C. Rely on general industry best practices for scientific exchange, assuming that most regulatory bodies share similar expectations regarding the dissemination of medical information. Option D. Create distinct communication materials and engagement protocols specifically tailored to the unique regulatory requirements and guidelines of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, for the U.S. market and the European Medicines Agency, EMA, for the EU market. The correct answer is B. Develop a single, comprehensive set of materials and engagement protocols that adhere to the strictest common regulatory principles found across both the FDA and EMA frameworks. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a critical need for medical affairs professionals to understand the nuanced differences in regulatory frameworks when engaging with global stakeholders. This scenario is professionally challenging because a one-size-fits-all approach to regulatory compliance is not only ineffective, but can lead to significant legal and ethical breaches. The complexity arises from differing interpretations of scientific data, promotional standards, and data privacy regulations across major regulatory bodies like the FDA and EMA. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a commitment to rigorous, jurisdiction-specific compliance by tailoring engagement strategies and information dissemination to the precise requirements of the FDA for the U.S. market and the EMA for the EU market. The medical affairs professional ensures adherence to local laws and guidelines. This proactive and detailed understanding minimizes the risk of off-label promotion, data privacy violations, and other regulatory infractions, thereby protecting the company and upholding professional integrity. An incorrect approach that relies on a generalized understanding of regulatory principles, without specific attention to the FDA's stringent requirements for promotional materials, and the EMA's distinct guidelines on clinical trial data transparency and pharmacovigilance, would be professionally unacceptable. This failure to differentiate between regulatory bodies constitutes a significant ethical lapse and a direct violation of regulatory mandates. Specifically, it risks misinterpreting or misapplying rules regarding the dissemination of scientific information, potentially leading to unauthorized claims or inadequate disclosure, which are serious regulatory offenses. Another incorrect approach might involve assuming that a successful engagement strategy in one region can be directly replicated in another without thorough due diligence. This overlooks critical differences in, for example, the definition of a medical expert or the acceptable channels for scientific exchange, leading to potential noncompliance and reputational damage. Professional reasoning in such situations requires a systematic process. First, identify the target jurisdiction, S, and the specific regulatory bodies governing them. Second, conduct a thorough review of the relevant laws, guidelines, and precedents for each jurisdiction. Third, assess the proposed activity or communication against these specific requirements, identifying any potential conflicts or areas of ambiguity. Fourth, consult with legal and regulatory affairs experts within the organization for each relevant jurisdiction. Finally, develop and implement a strategy that is demonstrably compliant with all applicable regulations, prioritizing accuracy, transparency, and ethical conduct. Question 20. Process analysis reveals a medical affairs specialist is planning to engage with a prominent key opinion leader, call, who is also a high-volume prescriber of a relevant therapeutic class. The specialist's objective is to gather insights into unmet medical needs and discuss emerging scientific data related to the company's investigational product. Which approach best upholds regulatory compliance and ethical best practices in stakeholder engagement? Option A. Schedule a series of meetings with the KOL, focusing on presenting the latest clinical trial data and soliciting their opinions on the product's potential benefits, while also subtly inquiring about their current prescribing patterns for competitor products. Option B. Directly ask the KOL for their feedback on how the investigational product could improve their patient outcomes and encourage them to consider prescribing it for suitable patients, emphasizing the company's support for their clinical practice. Option C. Propose an advisory board meeting with the KOL and other relevant experts to discuss the scientific rationale for the investigational product and explore unmet needs in the therapeutic area, ensuring all discussions are documented and focused on scientific exchange. Option D. Limit engagement to providing the KOL with publicly available scientific literature, and avoid any direct discussions about the investigational product's potential use or benefits to prevent any perception of influence. The correct answer is A. Schedule a series of meetings with the KOL, focusing on presenting the latest clinical trial data and soliciting their opinions on the product's potential benefits, while also subtly inquiring about their current prescribing patterns for competitor products. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in medical affairs, balancing the need for robust data generation with the ethical and regulatory imperative to avoid influencing clinical decision-making through inappropriate engagement. Medical affairs professionals must navigate complex relationships with key opinion leaders, call, and other stakeholders, ensuring that interactions are transparent, scientifically driven, and compliant with all relevant regulations. The challenge lies in identifying and mitigating potential conflicts of interest or perceptions of undue influence, particularly when engaging with individuals who are also prescribers or decision-makers within healthcare systems. The correct approach emphasizes a proactive, transparent, and data-centric engagement strategy. This involves clearly defining the scientific objectives of the engagement, ensuring all interactions are documented, and focusing discussions on objective scientific information rather than promotional content or direct patient care advice. This aligns with the principles of good medical practice and regulatory guidelines that govern interactions with healthcare professionals, promoting scientific exchange and evidence-based decision-making. The focus on providing balanced scientific information and respecting the autonomy of the healthcare professional in their clinical practice is paramount. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the perceived influence of a KOL without a clear scientific rationale for engagement risks being perceived as an attempt to unduly influence prescribing habits or clinical practice. This could violate regulations prohibiting inducements or off-label promotion, even if unintentional. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes relationship building over scientific rigor might lead to superficial interactions that do not advance medical knowledge or patient care, and could also be misconstrued as an attempt to gain favor rather than engage in genuine scientific exchange. Finally, an approach that avoids engagement altogether due to fear of misinterpretation, while seemingly cautious, can hinder the dissemination of important scientific information and prevent valuable feedback from being gathered, ultimately not serving the best interests of medical advancement. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes scientific integrity, regulatory compliance, and ethical conduct. This involves clearly understanding the purpose of any stakeholder engagement, ensuring it is aligned with the company's medical strategy and product lifecycle, and meticulously documenting all interactions. A thorough risk assessment should be conducted to identify potential conflicts of interest or perceptions of undue influence, and appropriate mitigation strategies should be implemented. Transparency, objectivity, and a commitment to evidence-based communication are the cornerstones of effective and compliant stakeholder engagement in medical affairs.